Hello everybody, my name is Heather Williams. I'm from the University at Buffalo. I'm here to talk to you about our work called Occurrence Doesn't Imply Success, using Purple Martin landlord data to evaluate the purpose of species distribution models. So as conservationists, we often want to find out the best areas for different species. We want to identify the areas that have got a high population growth rate and that high abundance, areas that are able to support large and growing populations of a certain species. Unfortunately, it can be really hard to get that data. Sometimes we've got sea turtles or trees which live a really long time, so we have to be very patient to get that data. Or we've got something like a coral which is spawning its offspring out into the water, making it hard to track the success of any individuals to figure out what that population growth rate is. Maybe our species flies away like the red knot and it's got a wide distribution and is hard to track. Or like many mammal species, perhaps it's relatively cryptic and it's hard to find those individuals. Nonetheless, these are really the metrics that we most care about as conservationists. We want to find those areas which can support abundance and high population growth rate, so we can either conserve them or try to replicate those conditions elsewhere. Because that data is relatively hard to get, we often have to make do with occurrence data. Occurrence data is much easier to get because all you need to do is observe a species being in the field one time, note down that location, and you've got a data point. So you can do this through surveys, through accessing museum records, or perhaps using citizen science databases where people note, like in eBird, when and where they saw certain species. Because this occurrence data is so much easier to get, we often use that data to make a species distribution model. In these models, we combine these occurrence points on a map with a various set of environmental predictors to end up with a map showing the predicted habitat suitability for a species in a given area. So we can have a prediction of where species are most likely to occur. These sorts of models are used extensively in conservation to help us make decisions about which areas to conserve. This wasn't quite the thing that we wanted in the beginning, it's just the data that's easy to get. So when we do this, we're making this implicit assumption that the areas where a species is most likely to occur are the same areas as where a species is likely to do best in terms of its population growth rate or in terms of its abundance. So this has been relatively hard to test, and for the simple reason it's hard to get that data on abundance and it's hard to get that data on population growth rate. Where it has been tested in terms of abundance, we have found some support for that relationship, although we often have to do this using less than ideal data sources. Where we've tested it and tried to look at the link between habitat suitability for occurrence and population growth rate, the evidence has really not been great so far. There has been some support. For example, red-backed shrikes have fledged more juvenile offspring in areas which have got a higher habitat suitability in these models. And there are some instances of models finding support for this idea at relatively small scales for various bird species. But the overall picture is actually fairly negative where it's been tested so far, in that there's few cases of habitat suitability in the model having a strong or positive link with population growth rates. However, we have been pretty limited in how well we can test this idea due to that lack of data. Enter the purple martin. Purple martins are wonderful species. They're also wonderfully data rich. Like many bird species, we've got great occurrence data available to us through eBird. We've also got good records of breeding and abundance through time through the Breeding Bird Survey. But what makes Purple Martins unique is the data that we have through Project Martin Watch. This is a citizen science project which is run by the PMCA. Many of you may be a part of it. In the project, Purple Martin landlords submit records of how well their colony has done each year. So how many eggs, how many of them hatch, how many of them fledge. So at the time that we used this, there was more than 100,000 records in that database across the eastern range of the Purple Martin's breeding region, starting in 1994. One final useful piece of data available for Purple Martins is from the PMCA survey, which happened a few years ago now. In that survey, landlords reported the occupancy of their Purple Martin housing. So what percentage was occupied or how many cavities, to give us an idea of very local abundance. This gave us a great opportunity to actually test this idea about species distribution models. So our goals in this project were to use the occurrence records in eBird to make a species distribution model in much the same way as most conservation purposes have to end. But then we would be able to go one step further and really test this model using the data largely from Project Martin Watch to see if there was a real link between habitat suitability in the model and the things that we actually care more about population growth rate. So using ideas about local fecundity, local abundance, and regional abundance. So we used a large data set of species occurrences from eBird to make this model. And we used kind of this handful of environmental predictors, which we knew from previous work would be likely to have an effect on Purple Martin distribution. That modelling process gave us a map which looked like this. So colours which are closer to yellow show a high habitat suitability, so a high probability that Purple Martins will occur. Areas which are closer to purple show that low probability of occurrence, or it's less suitable for Purple Martins. We tested the quality of this model in various ways with internal data or independent data and found it was a pretty good fit. It was accurately describing occurrence. Here's some of those predicted environmental relationships. So martins like it relatively warm in June. They like a small amount of tree cover, but not to be fully forested. They like to be close to water. And they like some people to be around to provide them with housing, presumably. But beyond a certain threshold, population density didn't have an impact on their occurrence probability. So this would be where many conservation studies would be forced to stop. But we had the advantage of this Project Martin Watch data. So we used data from more than 87,000 nests from close to 600 colony locations across the range over 22 years. It's a great data set. So we used this data to work hard to try to look for a link between habitat suitability in the model and Purple Martin fecundity. So is there a link between predicted suitability and how many eggs they lay, how many hatchlings, how many of them fledge? Does it matter what spatial scale we look at? Does it matter if we look at it overall for the 22 years of the study or year on year? We looked at it both at the colony level and at the nest level. So all of these possible combinations gave us 228 different analyses to have a go at to try to look for this. This table summarizes those results. So these are all the different categories of fecundity metrics that we looked at. The first column is showing you the proportion of those where we found a statistically significant relationship. And the second column shows you the proportion of variation which was explained by those statistically significant relationships, where 1 would be a perfect relationship and 0 would be nothing. Hopefully, as you look at this, you are feeling as underwhelmed as we did, very few of these relationships have any statistical significance, and those that do explain very little of the variation. So there was really no support for a link between these sorts of species distribution model outputs and how well martins actually do in your nest boxes. Similarly underwhelming, there was really no evidence of a convincing link between the occupancy percentage, or the number of cavities occupied, at the colony level, this very local level, based on the PMCA survey data. Where we did find some more hope of a link between the SDMs and the things we really care about was looking at regional abundance from the breeding bird survey data. So in this case, as habitat suitability in our model increased, we found this kind of threshold-like increase in the relative abundance of purple martins. So the largest colonies of martins, or the largest regional populations of martins, occur in areas predicted the most suitable in these models. So to summarise these results, we made a decent species distribution model, but we were unable to find a link between its output and fecundity, how well martins are doing with their breeding attempts in the nest boxes, or with local abundance, how many martins are showing up at your colonies. We did find a link between regional abundance and habitat quality. So why aren't these models doing the job that we hoped they would? Why is occurrence apparently not the same thing as success? So it seems like these models are describing good neighbourhoods, but not good sites. What defines a very local good site might have more to do with competition between individuals. It might have more to do with different Purple Martin box designs and maintenance, with kind of the human factors, as well as there just being a lot of variation in how well each colony does between different years. More worryingly, we might be seeing a lag effect in the Purple Martin distribution. Purple Martins are quite highly philopatric. They come back to the same areas year on year, and often their offspring follow that same migratory pathway. If habitat quality declined in that area through time, martins might still nevertheless keep showing up, leading to this lag effect or potential for an extinction debt in the species. So as far as species distribution models go and our usage of them for conservation, this is not great news. Species distribution models are still great for predicting occurrence and perhaps even regional level abundance. But occurrence and success are far from synonymous until these species distribution models can really include these super local effects of biotic interactions and more behavioural impacts based on the species. They may be limited in their utility. I think that this study also showed that the purple martin is really an ideal species to test this with, thanks to the amazing level of citizen science data that's available with that species. With that, I would like to thank any of you who contributed data to Project Martin Watch. We truly couldn't have done this without you. I'd like to thank the PMCA for inviting me to talk, as well as my co-authors on this paper, Joe Siegrist and Adam Wilson. I'll be happy to answer questions from any of you that have any, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference.